Hello and welcome to the Geocurrents lecture series on the history and geography of natural psychoactive substances. Today's lecture is on cannabis, or marijuana if you will, and note that this is part one of a two-part lecture. Today I'm going to be talking about cannabis as a plant and drug. I'll talk a little bit more about its drug attributes than I do with most of these substances. This is largely because of the controversies and complexities surrounding cannabis as a mind-altering substance. I'll move on to talk about the domestication of cannabis and its later separation into drug and seed and fiber producing strains. I'll move on to the initial spread of cannabis in Eurasia, particularly spread of cannabis as a drug plant in Central Asia. I'll talk about the first known cannabis culture, that of the Scythians of Central Asia. And then I'll conclude this talk with the spread of cannabis as a drug into India. Note that on this Venn diagram of mind-altering substances, dividing them into stimulants, depressants, and hallucinogens, marijuana or cannabis is right in the middle, and the only one that occupies that position. So is it at once a stimulant, a depressant, and a hallucinogen? Or is it rather something that is difficult to classify, that has unique effects unlike those of other drugs? And perhaps, as has been suggested, it may even have triphasic effects. This means that the effects really vary by dose and may move from one set of effects to another to a third, depending on how much is consumed. Cannabis is now regarded as one species. Formerly three were recognized: Cannabis sativa, Cannabis indica, and Cannabis ruderalis. There's still debate about this. Certainly they hybridize very easily. Almost all modern strains of cannabis are mixed sativa and indica. And so many botanists say they really cannot be regarded as separate species. Sativa and indica are by far the most important ones and are the ones that have been used for drug production. Supposedly, sativa and indica strains have different effects. You'll see this sort of diagram all over the place if you have any involvement with cannabis. So sativa strains are supposed to result in a more mental or cerebral high as opposed to the more body high of indica. We see differences between supposedly sativa resulting in more alertness and indica with relaxation. Indica is a sleep aid and sativa for creativity. I have to say I'm very skeptical of this. I don't really think it makes much difference. And I will admit here that a lot of my information on this comes from my own personal experience. So I am a cannabis user. And have been for more than half a century. I'm a very regular user, meaning that I use it regularly, but also in a very sort of strict way. I'm very disciplined about it, which goes against the stereotypes, to be sure. But anyway, what does make a bit of a difference is what's known as the cannabinoid profile. So there are at least 113 cannabinoids, substances produced by cannabis, which fit particular receptors in the brain and in the body as well. By far, the two most important of these are THC and CBD. THC is essentially the psychoactive component, tetrahydrocannabinol, whereas CBD has physical effects, but much less mental and more physical. And different strains, I should say, do vary in the cannabinoid profile. Many indica strains have more CBD, so yeah, that can make a difference. But most strains that one would purchase in a dispensary or even in the black market, I suppose, are, as I said before, hybrids anyway. So I'm pretty suspicious again about these sorts of diagrams here. CBD, antipsychotic, that's been suggested, but there's no real good evidence. Antitumoral, I know a lot of people who believe this, but the evidence is inconsistent, let's put it that way. So again, I can just say that more research is needed. THC as a relaxant, well, for some people maybe, but not for all. as an analgesic, a pain reliever. Well, slightly, but nothing like opium. It's not a very good analgesic. Uh, there are also a lot of claims these days about the minor cannabinoids like CBN. THC will actually degrade into CBN, so old cannabis will have more CBN. It's usually marketed as a sleep aid. People talk also about the entourage effect of all of the different cannabinoids having different effects and interacting with each other, but a lot of this is very speculative. There hasn't been much solid research yet. Also, cannabis connoisseurs often talk and write about terpenes. These are simply essences of flavor and smell. You can find these terpenes in many, many different plants. So some claim they have psychoactive effects. I'm quite skeptical of that as well. One reason why I think we get a lot of these claims is cannabis tends to enhance suggestibility, and human beings are in general quite suggestible. And so when people are told, "Oh, this is a sativa strain with this and that terpene profile, and it's going to make you very alert," and then, well, often people then think they're alert afterwards. Just my humble opinion. THC definitely changes levels of neurotransmitters. I'm not going to go into the biochemical details here. Again, I have an illustration just showing a cannabinoid receptor. There are many receptors in the human brain and elsewhere in the human body, and the cannabinoid molecules have to fit into those receptors like a lock and key. But anyway, there's been quite a bit of research done, but there's still a lot of uncertainty about how exactly THC works with dopamine and other neurotransmitters. What is very important and has been fairly recently discovered is the body produces its own cannabinoids, endocannabinoids, that fit into these receptors. And so receptors that have sort of been built for molecules that the human body produces, then some of them can receive these chemicals from cannabis. So you can see THC fits into CB1 receptors, CBN, the cannabinoid noted as a sleep inducer, at least for many, fits into another, and CBD doesn't actually have its own receptor, but it has influences on the others. And research is starting to show that endocannabinoids in this receptor system is very important for all sorts of things: control of movement and learning and memory, emotion and motivation, addictive behavior, pain modulation. Intriguingly, the CB1 receptors that work with THC are mainly in the brain, and they're absent in the brain stem. This is often suggested as one of the main reasons why it is very difficult, if not impossible, to overdose on cannabis and die from it. It's simply, well, it may have happened, but it's not something that regularly happens even with massive doses, because the brain stem, which keeps the body running, simply isn't affected. And intriguingly, again, the CB2 receptors are located mainly in the immune system. Another thing that is well known is that habitual cannabis users, people who use large quantities often, have changes in their receptors, and they get a large level of tolerance. This is true for many drugs. Certainly is for THC. It's interesting for heavy use, as this diagram shows. The receptor count decreases as receptors are actually retracted into the cell membrane. So a heavy user of cannabis is going to need much more to have the same effects than a neophyte or a very light user. There are deep controversies about the psychological effects of cannabis. I urge caution in reading about this, because it's often misunderstood, it's often overgeneralized. We get exaggerated positive views and exaggerated negative views. So I have a couple of illustrations I just pulled off the web. One, a very positive view, associating cannabis with relaxation and euphoria, clear thinking, sociability, laughter, many other positive attributes. For most of these, I would say, yeah, to some degree, clear thinking, sometimes confused thinking, muddled thinking, yes, sometimes, depending on the person, depending on the dose, depending on many, many other things. For the negative view here, we have even for short-term psychological effects, magical or random thinking. Well, that may occur with some people, but certainly not with many. Short-term memory loss, I would disagree with that. Yeah, people after consuming cannabis will sometimes lose track of a conversation, but that's simply because their mind is jumping around to new topics. It's not quite the same. What is really important to note is cannabis affects different people differently. Sorry about the spelling error there. And I'd say perhaps more than any other psychoactive substance, at least any of the others that I'm covering here. Yeah, people have different reactions to alcohol and even to nicotine, but it's fairly slight, where it seems to be with cannabis very, very large differences. I'll quote here Edward Slingerland, whose book Drunk, How We Sip, Dance, and Stumble Our Way to Civilization is one that I have recommended for a positive view of alcohol in human history. I mentioned that in the introductory lecture to this series, but he claims anyway, pot makes some people extroverted and energetic, others introverted, paranoid, and lethargic. And that certainly can be true. It actually can make one person energetic in one circumstance and lethargic in another too. I mean, so effects vary from person to person, but also from time to time. The Wikipedia has a list of, not a list, but it's extracted out of this article, of the effects of THC with a moderate dose and then with a high dose. That'll be the next slide. And I contrast this with my own experience. And my own experience, I'm just speaking about myself. Like I say, it varies from person to person. But it notes that a moderate dose is often associated with euphoria, but note at the bottom, it's also associated with anxiety and panic attacks, quite the opposite of euphoria. Supposedly associated with the increased appreciation of the arts. That can be true for some people, or an enhanced sense of humor. That's often the case. Metacognition, or thinking about thinking and introspection, that's often true. Increase sensuality, libido, appetite. I would say also that's often true. It tends to enhance taste of food, for example. At least it does for me. Enhance creativity. That's one reason. That's one of the main reasons why I use cannabis, as well as abstract thinking. Disruption of linear memory. Yeah, there's a lot of truth in that. The way I would describe its effects on myself is it sort of untethers the mind and allows the mind to have insights, I suppose, and to generate abundant ideas. I have to say, both good ideas and bad ideas, as I have often said to friends and members of my family. All of my best ideas have come when I'm under the influence of cannabis, and all of my worst ideas have come as well. So you have to be careful. And it can, at least for me, facilitate delving deeply into any issues that I'm concerned about. The Wikipedia's depiction of the effects of high dose would be pretty serious here. Illusions, hallucinations, paranoia, acute psychosis, and dissociative states. Maybe I've never had a high enough dose. I have had 3 occasions doses that were unpleasantly high, once on purpose, twice on accident. Both came from edibles. I'm generally an old-fashioned cannabis smoker, and for me it would be impossible to smoke enough to experience anything like that. After a certain amount of ingestion of smoke, that's enough for the lungs. But after a couple of experiences with high doses of edibles, I found that my mind was just jumping from topic to topic in a very disconcerting way. I didn't have hallucinations, but I had a lot of vivid mental images many of them were unpleasant, and I suffered a certain amount of physical discomfort, including balance problems. So it's nothing I want to have anything to do with again in my life. So to recapitulate some of this, the big question: why do the mental effects of THC vary so widely? So a lot of this has to do simply with individual personality and physiological differences. And there's probably a strong genetic component. It has a lot to do with dose and cannabinoid profile. The term set and setting is mostly used for hallucinogens, and I'll talk about that later on. But it's where you are, the environment, how you're feeling at the time. That's sort of your mindset. And I would add sort of individual and cultural expectations at any given session of using it. And then finally, habituation to cannabis. If you are somebody who has never used it before and you take a large dose, that's a good chance you're going to have a very negative experience. Now, it's very clear that THC levels are increasing. And we actually have data from this. So this is raw plant material seized by the DEA from 1993 to 2019. And you can see an increase from 3.4 to 13.9, essentially. In dispensaries, certainly in California today, cannabis flowers are generally going to be 20 to 30%. There have been some scandals with testing laboratories, artificially inflating that number because the higher the number, the more valuable it is in the market. And I should say I think that's a tragic situation, or certainly a negative situation. I would mention, though, in the 1990s in California, at least in Northern California, cannabis was already well above 5%, not 30%, however. And then you could see from the various ways in which cannabis material is processed to make things like crumble or shatter, resin, rosin vapes, edibles, and the like, you can get much, much higher percentages. I think it's pretty clear that as prevalence of use has increased, and especially as potency has increased, problems have been emerging. So this is a Wall Street Journal article on what you aren't hearing about marijuana's health effects, quite recent. Take it with a grain of salt, but I think there's some validity here. 30% of cannabis users have a use disorder compared to 13% of alcohol drinkers. Well, maybe I'd like to see follow-up studies. Academic outcomes are much lower for habitual cannabis users than for habitual drinkers. May be true. Again, I'd like to see the underlying data. And heavy use of cannabis correlates with psychosis and other serious mental problems. I can say to some extent, but it's important to note what that extent is. Certainly, cannabis use is increasing. This is from 1969 to 2022, according to a Gallup poll of people who have ever tried marijuana or cannabis, now up to about 50%. And some evidence that it's actually surpassing alcohol in daily use. Here's an article from The Hill, relatively recent, claiming that 7.7 million people in 2022 recorded daily or near daily use compared to 14.7 with alcohol. That alcohol number surprises me. I would suspect it's much higher. People are not by any means always honest in responding to surveys and the like about these sorts of things. Anyway, you can look at the other parts of that slide later on if you like. I also want to take up this question of whether cannabis is really hallucinogenic. Does it really belong in the center of that Venn diagram? Should we really put it in the same circle as LSD or psilocybin or other hallucinogenic substances? And there are certainly plenty of people, scholars even, who claim that it is and have some evidence for it. This slide just notes that psychotic symptoms such as delusions and hallucination appear at very high doses. We'll have to ask, how high is that dose? There is also evidence, though, that cannabis is not hallucinogenic in the sense that a real hallucinogen like DMT or LSD is. So here's a fairly recent article on hallucinations following acute cannabis dosing. It's a pretty solid study, and it notes hallucinogen-like effects and claims they've mostly occurred after administration of a purified delta-9 tetrahydrocannabinol rather than whole plant. And with the whole plant, you do get some buffering because you have, in addition to the THC, have other cannabinoids, which really can change the way the brain processes it. I would also note, though, that there is something called cannabis use disorder, which now the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders includes. It's basically cannabis addiction. When I was young, it was commonly thought cannabis was not addicting at all, but there's been reassessment of that, and medical professionals now think that yes, it can be. And they note the symptoms, dependency of THC, and withdrawal signs such as dysphoria, anxiety, irritability, depression, depersonalization, restlessness, disturbed sleep, gastrointestinal problems, and decreased appetite. I think this is real, but one has to be a very heavy user. At my level of use, for example, I don't experience any of this. I very often travel abroad and go without for long periods of time, weeks, months, over a year in a couple of cases. And I've experienced nothing like that. The only thing I do experience now if I go without cannabis is a little bit more difficulty falling asleep and staying asleep. On the other hand, I experience more vivid dreams. So it's kind of a draw on that effect. And then finally on this line of inquiry, I do want to note the cannabis hyperemesis syndrome, and this is something that nobody knew about when I was younger. Excuse me, but it is coming in again with very high dose prolonged use. A number of people, not all certainly, but many experience recurrent nausea and vomiting and abdominal cramping and pains. Very interestingly, they often get relief with a hot shower. But actually, finally, this is in the same line of inquiry. But this, to me, is the biggest question. Does cannabis use generate, or is it associated with it, correlated with what is known as the amotivational syndrome? And this is just a syndrome of people, particularly young people, who really have no motivation. So you can see the term was coined in 1886 by a psychologist and a psychiatrist working together, looking at chronic marijuana smoking among young people. And they reported that it contributes to a more passive, inward-turning personality, subtle, progressive change from conforming, achievement-oriented behavior to a state of relaxed carelessness and careless drifting, and such individuals exhibit greater introversion and become basically separated from society, and a tendency towards regressive, childlike, magical thinking. And to be sure, some studies have suggested this. So here's a fairly recent study, 2018. Results showed that only marijuana, but not alcohol or tobacco intake, significantly and longitudinally, or in other words, over time, prompted lower initiative and persistence. Findings provide support for the marijuana amotivational syndrome and underscores marijuana as a risk factor in general self-efficacy and offers implications in science and so on. Important to note, though, that other studies come to different conclusions, debunk the linkage. So here was a meta-study looking claiming that 5 non-acute studies which used behavioral tasks to assess motivation found that cannabis use was associated with higher willingness to expend effort for reward. So these studies have had mixed results. I might as well give my view. And my view is that cannabis can really exacerbate the amotivational syndrome, but does not cause it. Not a causal relationship. Put this differently, people who are highly motivated and smoke cannabis do not, in general, there may be exceptions, but do not turn into amotivated people. They don't lose their motivation. In fact, sometimes it's enhanced. But people who already have a problem with motivation will find that what cannabis does is alleviates their boredom, and it then prevents it, by it I mean boredom, from motivating people with motivational problems. As Robert Pirsig famously said, boredom always precedes a period of great creativity. Well, not always by any means, but sometimes it does. And I think there are similar problems though with digital entertainment. It's just so easy to have something to entertain yourself with. It could be watching YouTube videos or TikTok, or it could be smoking cannabis, but it allows people who really are not engaged in life to stay unengaged when otherwise sheer boredom may force a change. My own personal thoughts on the matter. And finally on this, I'd mention I think cannabis can enhance motivation for people who are motivated and even serve as a productivity tool. Again, this is from my own personal experience. I find it very helpful for imagining and visualizing new initiatives. For example, if I want to, if I want to write a new book or an article or engage on something as crazy as a YouTube lecture series, all those ideas come to me under the influence of cannabis. But I use it more precisely for, say, outlining a lecture or an article, for generating new ideas. I definitely use it for editing my prose or my slides. I find that if I've written something and then I smoke some cannabis and reread it, I can really tell where there are problems. In a normal state of mind, I might just gloss through them. But if there's a gap in logic or a problem with flow, I know it's an issue. I can't write under cannabis. I never do that, but I certainly edit. And a lot of times it's just noting a problem here, come back to it. And finally, I find that can help cement knowledge and deepen understanding. I came to this conclusion actually when I was a junior in college. I had been a curious student, but not a particularly diligent one. I mean, I got good grades, but I didn't get the best grades. But at that point, I decided I wanted to go to graduate school after college, and I wanted to be at the top of the class, which I was able to do, and I found it was very helpful to use cannabis. I'd study for an exam. A day before, I'd get everything done, and then I'd ingest some cannabis, have a few puffs, and go over my notes and go over my thinking and looking for, again, connections and sort of cementing it. And I found that was very helpful. Now, I've suggested this same strategy to other people, and nobody has taken me up on it. They've all said, it doesn't work for me. So this might be partly the uniqueness of my own psychological makeup. But enough of myself. Let's get finally into the heart of the matter, the historical geography of cannabis. Barney Whorf, a geographer, has an interesting article. It's a decade old. Some of it's out of date. Some of it's a little too theoretical for my taste, but it's an excellent article, and I would very much recommend it. It's a map derived from that article. I've made a few changes, though. Whorf has the postulated domestication area in Central Asia. That was what was thought 10 years ago. There have been some new studies that show that no, cannabis was domesticated, almost certainly in northern China. And then I added seeds and fiber and seeds in Europe and Japan because cannabis moved into those areas, but there's no evidence that it was used as a mind-altering substance in either place. And so it's really important to distinguish that. So anyway, this a recent article, 2021, a very large, large-scale whole genome resequencing unravels the domestication history. Now, further studies may change our understanding, but right now this is the best we have. And it seems that cannabis was domesticated early in the Neolithic, some 10,000 years ago, in northern China. And it seems to have been used at the time for seeds and fiber, and perhaps for drug use as well. even more, well, equally interesting, the article found evidence for the change in the genome of cannabis separating hemp and drug cultivars. Right now, a hemp cultivar of cannabis has very little THC, impossible to get high on, if you will. And drug cultivars are not useful for making rope. And so there was selective breeding and different lines emerged. And the article suggests that it's separated into these fiber and seed on one hand and drug strains about 2,000 years ago, 2000 BCE. Note on the diagram with humulus or hops, that is a closely related plant to cannabis. So when they were one plant, we're back many, many millions of years, but then its differentiation under selective breeding into these different types. And then the fiber strain spread quite widely all the way to Middle East, Europe, to Japan on the other side. And the drug strains were for a long time concentrated in Central Asia and then in India. Let's talk a little bit about hemp fiber. It has been historically extremely important. The word canvas, for example, is a cognate from cannabis. It comes from the same source. If anyone's interested in the history of this, I would greatly recommend Alfred Crosby, which I should know was one of the greatest geohistorical academic writers. But Crosby's one, I think it was his first book before he gained fame with books like The Columbian Exchange and Ecological Imperialism. But anyway, it was on America, Russia, hemp, and Napoleon. Pretty specific here. American trade with Russia and the Baltic, because Russia was the big producer of hemp and exporter of it during this time period. And as the illustration shows, hemp sailed the world because the sails and the ropes of early modern ships were largely made of canvas from hemp. Interestingly, in the late 1800s, hemp for roping really diminished, if not almost disappeared. It was replaced by jute, which is a fiber from Bengal in India, or abaca, which is a plant related to banana grown in the Philippines, sometimes called Manila hemp. Rope made out of jute and abaca was actually more water resistant and sort of took over. And hemp was widely used for clothing, but was not in the early days very comfortable, and was largely replaced by cotton in Europe by the early 1800s. So hemp seed was evidently quite important in the original domestication of cannabis way back in the Neolithic period, over 10,000 years ago. But archaeological and literary evidence suggests that it disappeared from the Chinese diet altogether about 600 CE or AD. In most of Europe, it was found mostly as a famine food, eaten a bit more in Russia. So not particularly palatable, at least in many forms. It was important, very important, as birdseed until cannabis was essentially outlawed in the 1930s. When that happened, canary breeders were some of the lobbyists against this change, because they said, hemp seeds are the best seeds for breeding canaries. Today, both hemp clothing and hemp seeds are coming back. I think modern processing has made hemp clothing much more comfortable. It used to be quite stiff and rough. And I think they've done the same with hemp seeds. I haven't looked deeply into this, but that's my suspicion. There's been some debate over whether the ancient Chinese really used cannabis as a drug. We know there's evidence, literary evidence, of people separating male from female plants, and I'll talk about that in a second. But that is only going to be done if you're using it for a drug, because the female plants that produce it. If you're using it for fiber or seed, well, if you're using it for seeds, you need the male and the female plants. Anyway, the ancient Chinese plants had cannabis in their pharmacopoeia, so it had some medicinal use. It evidently was used by shamans for ritual and oracular purposes, for predictions, but the elite mainstream, which was steeped in Confucian philosophy, had a very low opinion of that. And there's really no evidence of recreational use in ancient or medieval or early modern China for that matter. So just to note that unlike most plants, cannabis is dioecious, meaning it has distinct male and female plants with distinct flowers. And it's only the females that produce large quantities of cannabinoids. What growers want to do is get rid of the males as soon as they can. They don't want any seeds produced. And the female flowers will then just continue to grow and grow and grow, just desperate for pollen, if you will, and produce tremendous amounts of resin. You can see the trichomes, the resin-containing structures in that flower and on those leaves associated with it. So it was always a difficulty for cannabis farmers to get rid of the male plants and keep them from seeding the precious females. That led first to cloning female plants, and more recently, sellers of seeds have learned how to feminize seeds so that they don't produce male plants. So here's an advertisement for bulk cannabis seeds, forbidden fruit, feminized. But guess what? Nature responds by producing more and more hermaphrodites, plants that are female, but then, guess what? They start producing male flowers. And this is the bane of many growers. You have to be very careful to look at every single branch all the time for hermaphrodites. Back to the issue of drug use, the first firm evidence for cannabis as a drug is from 2,500 years ago, 500 BCE. It was almost certainly used as a drug much earlier, but this is from an archaeological excavation in a cemetery in very high altitude area in what is now Western China. It wasn't part of the Chinese cultural sphere at all at the time. It was part of the Central Asian cultural sphere. But at this excavation, they found skeletons and eating implements and musical implements, but also wooden braziers that were charred and had held burning material. And you can see from the illustration, ancient peoples put cannabis leaves, likely flowers, and hot stones in a brazier and inhaled the resulting smoke. They get it in an enclosed place. An extremely inefficient way of smoking, but the idea of smoking in a pipe or a cigarette or anything like that just simply wasn't there. It didn't come into Eurasia until tobacco came from the Americas. Perhaps in Africa, people may have been smoking cannabis before that, but there's no evidence of smoking in Europe or Asia. Well, smoking like this, and some people still do it, called hotboxing. It's got to be the most inefficient way of consuming it, and I imagine not particularly good for one's health either. This particular finding that I was talking about was found at over 9,000 foot elevation in the Pamir Mountains, right on the very western border of China, where China and Tajikistan come together. It was in an area of very close to trade routes, so-called Silk Roads. To quote from, I think this was from the article. I'm sorry, I don't have the actual citation here. But it's quite likely that people came across cannabis plants at higher elevations that were naturally producing higher THC levels. But humans may have also intervened to breed a more wicked weed, he adds. I think the latter theory is much more common, or much more likely. I don't really think cannabis is going to be able to grow and reproduce at 9,000 foot elevation in Central Asia. I don't think you're going to have a long enough growing season. So I think it was most likely brought in there and then had been bred. The ethnic group associated with this particular cemetery, as I said before, there's not Chinese, although there were Chinese goods there, but they were most likely Sogdians. So the Sogdians were an Iranian-speaking people of Central Asia. They lived in important cities, Bukhara, Samarkand, cities in Uzbekistan, but they were historically Sogdian speaking, and Sogdian ethnic group inhabited them. So Sogdia was, Sogdia is on the map here. You can see the topography, and I've added some of the modern polities, abbreviating some of them. So mostly in Uzbekistan, extending a bit into Tajikistan and Kyrgyzstan. But the Sogdians were a highly sophisticated people, urban people. They were the most important merchants of the Silk Road. They spread religious ideas from India into China and from Europe as well. So Buddhism comes into China mostly through Sogdian intermediaries. Manichaeism, a dualistic religion that was once very widespread over much of Western Eurasia. Also came into China. There was a period when the Uyghur people converted to Manichaeism. And Nestorian Christianity was also very common and came into China, where it actually got a lot of converts in China and Mongolia, but again, coming in through Sogdian intermediaries. So the Sogdians were very important people and seem to have had a particular association with cannabis. We get much more abundant evidence of extensive cannabis use, not so much, some archaeological evidence, but textual and other forms of evidence from the Scythian people, who were, unlike the Sogdians, the Scythians were nomadic pastoralists. So they raised large herds of cattle, sheep, goats, and rode horses. The Scythians were supposedly the first people to really master fighting on horseback. Horses had been used with chariots previously, but the Scythians learned how to fight with bow and arrow and with lances on horseback. That revolutionized warfare. It gave them a tremendous amount of strength. And Scythian populations, where you can see on this map, spreading from Ukraine and even into places like Romania, all the way to the border with China. Actually, the Scythians extended at their height quite a bit further to the east, probably all the way into northern China. So a very large cultural sphere with a lot of political and military power. The ancient Greeks were well acquainted with the Scythians, and Herodotus, often described as the father of history and the father of geography and the father of anthropology. But anyway, wrote this very, very long and complex text called the Histories, mostly about the war between the Greeks and the Persians, but with long excursions into the history and geography of other people. And Herodotus noted that the Scythians would take the seeds of hemp. Now, I have to say, seeds don't have much THC. They're probably more concerned with the flowers of hemp. But they would go under their mats while basically going into a tent and throw the cannabis seeds on red-hot stones while probably using a brazier. And so thrown it smolders and produces such vapor that no Greek vapor bath might exceed it. And delighted by the vapor bath, the Scythians howl. I've never heard anyone howl from the joy of cannabis smoke, but well, maybe it did happen. All kinds of interesting evidence, though, about Scythians and cannabis use and opium use as well. Here's a National Geographic article, 2015. Gold artifacts tell tales of drug-fueled rituals and bastard wars. So we have a gold Scythian artifact there with a scene of murder, or of killing at any rate. And a quote from the article, because the sticky residue was found on the inside of the vessels, Belinsky and Gass think that they used to brew a drink of strong opium concoction while cannabis was burning nearby. That both drugs were being used simultaneously is beyond doubt, Gass says. So interesting to combine those, and there's some evidence that they were combining ephedra as well, which is a powerful stimulant I talked about in a previous lecture. Scythians were well known for their gold work. Some of the most exquisite gold work of the ancient world was done by Scythian artisans and those they employed. Interestingly, a lot of them are very violent. A lot of them show violent scenes with animals, killing and eating each other, and violent scenes with people as well. So the Scythians were, like I say, militarily very powerful. So the Scythians were consuming cannabis. Does it mean, though, that there was regular consumption among all their different groups? For example, were Scythian warriors regular cannabis smokers? Were they using it when they were fighting? I find that unlikely. ephedra would be a much better drug to take for actions of war. Quite interesting YouTube video on Scythian gods, the religion of the steppe horse lords, makes this claim with some pretty interesting illustrations. The Scythian man on the horse, he's wearing a typical Scythian hat, pointed top, and you see these elaborate smoke rings coming out. So the suggestion is quite clear. But we don't know. I mean, we know Scythians were consuming cannabis, but we don't know in exactly what context and who was doing it. It has been suggested that much of the cannabis was being used by their shamans or shamans. And we have good evidence from Greek textual sources about the Scythian shamans. They're called the Enare, and they were a sort of a transgender group. So men who dressed as women and often lived as women, although they also, I believe, often are usually married and had children. So, of course, some trans women do that. It's not unknown by any means. So here we have an article saying, the Scythian shamans regularly used cannabis and may have been transgender. Well, to some extent they were. And I find it very interesting that the Enare now are in fashion, and I mean that quite literally. So there's a clothing line called Lilla Bear. I had never heard about it. I was just looking for illustrations for this lecture and find that the Enare line of clothing is the epitome of non-binary clothing. And then in a DeviantArt, an interesting site, website, we have a depiction of a Scythian Enare shaman. I have no idea how accurate it is. The ancient Greeks were well acquainted with the Scythians and had a very mixed view. So to quote Strabo, a Greek author from the Roman period, who was probably the best known geographer of the Roman era, citing an earlier Greek philosopher Ephorus, quote, "The modes of life of the Scythians are unlike, whereas some are so cruel that they even eat human beings, others abstain from eating any living creature whatsoever. For there are some of the Scythian nomads who feed only on mare's milk and excel all other men in justice." Were they associated with the Enare? Perhaps. In ancient Greece, one Scythian thinker, not a shaman, a regular person, if you will, Anacharsis, moved from Scythia to ancient Athens. We think, I mean, there's some doubt about his actual existence. He's very important in ancient Greek literary traditions, but he was evidently there in an early period in the 6th century BCE. So there's some doubt about it. But as Wikipedia notes, later Greco-Roman tradition transformed Anacharsis into a legendary figure, a kind of noble savage who represented the barbarian wisdom of the Scythians, due to which the ancient Greeks included him as one of the 7 sages of ancient Greece. So a very high position indeed. And consequently, Anacharsis became a popular figure in Greek literature, and many legends arose about him, including claims that he had been a friend of Solon, who was the legendary, well, not legendary, but actual lawgiver of ancient Athens. If anyone is interested in the Scythians and their role in world history, I would recommend Christopher Beckwith's The Scythian Empire, Princeton University Press, 2023. I would also note, though, that this is a very controversial work. There are a lot of historians who think it is nonsensical. I've had colleagues of mine claim that Beckwith is borderline insane. I've read a number of Beckwith's books. I find them all very interesting. He's an audacious thinker. He's probably wrong on a lot of things. He's probably wrong on the Scythians. I mean, he claims that there was, say, in the 6th century, 7th century BCE, a kind of Scythian empire. I mean, it wasn't hierarchical polity. It was rather amorphous. But he maps the Scythians all the way, you could see here, from Ukraine all the way to Manchuria, and then this huge area of Scythian influence. And he thinks Scythian ideas, religious and political ideas, were tremendously important in inspiring empire building among the Persians and the ancient Chinese, and religious ideas. He even claims that both the Buddha and Lao Tzu, the founder of Taoism, were of Scythian origin. The last two ideas are highly unlikely. So, take this with a grain of salt if you want to read it, but I find it interesting. We also know that cannabis was widely used among the ancient Thracians. So Thrace is essentially modern Bulgaria, but the Thracian people were a separate group of Indo-European peoples. They had some affinity with the Scythians. Thracian gladiators were very important in ancient Rome, so they were noted also as a sort of a warrior people. But they had among them a group of shamans. The term literally means those who walk and smoke, a name given to the shamans of Thrace who practiced severe dietary restrictions of not consuming living beings and living on milk and honey. Well, true perhaps, hard to say, but it really fits with this idea of the Inare, this caste or class of shamans in ancient Scythia. The Greeks made some medical use of cannabis, but not much, and evidently not at all for its psychoactive effects. An interesting article here, 2008, but on medical use of cannabis among the Greeks and Romans, noting that Greek writers report using cannabis in treating horses and also people. The dried leaves used for nosebleeds, seed for tapeworms. Most frequently mentioned treatment involves steeping the green seeds in a liquid and then pressing that liquid, which was put into the ears as a remedy for ear pain and inflammation. And it wouldn't have had any psychoactive effect. If we look at Dioscorides, whose book Materia Medica was the basic medical botanical text of centuries, millennia even, all the way up into the early modern period, we can see here from an Arabic edition. So not just in the Western world, but also in the Muslim world. But he basically said, he has a listing for cannabis, and he says that it's when juiced, when it is green, it is good for pain in the ears, and that's about it. I find all this quite confusing. Like I say, the Greeks had very close association with the Scythians. You had people like Anacharsis, a Scythian philosopher. Also in the classic age, when not in the age of Pericles, but right after the age of Pericles, so in the 300s BCE, Athens had this crucial alliance with what was known as the Bosporan kingdom. This was not the main Bosporus, but what was known as sort of the Crimean Bosporus. It's the Strait of Kerch today. It's the strait between the Black Sea and the Sea of Azov in Ukraine and southern Russia, or what used to be Ukraine, I suppose we should say. But the Bosporan kingdom was a Greco-Scythian kingdom. This was the source of Athens' grain supply and dried fish, absolutely crucial for its economy. So they had lots of connections there, and it just seems to me that there would have been, these connections would have been rich enough to have brought in cannabis as a drug plant to Greece, but it doesn't seem to have happened. It spread into India, though, at an uncertain date. I spent quite a bit of time in preparing this lecture trying to find out when the first evidence of cannabis as a drug in India was found. This article, I don't know if it's the most authoritative, but it claims there's no use of it before 1000 CE or AD. Likely, though, it was used in India much sooner and probably introduced, guess what, by the Scythians, because one branch of the Scythian ethnic group left Central Asia, moved into India, settled northern western India quite extensively. The map shows a situation from about 150 BCE to 400 CE. The Indo-Scythians were enculturated into Indian culture. Some scholars think that many of them became military castes like the Rajputs. That's uncertain, but they certainly sort of became Indian. Uh, but they were there in large numbers and were quite powerful for quite some time. And so this is probably how cannabis as a drug came to India. Cannabis is definitely associated with the god Shiva. In Hinduism today, there are two main deities, Vishnu and Shiva. There are others as well, and most Hindus would consider them to be separate manifestations of the same ultimate divine entity. There are debates over whether Hinduism is monotheistic or polytheistic, but Lord Shiva is a very particular deity, if you will, with a lot of symbols and legends and stories. Extremely important. And Shiva has a number of sacred plants. We'll see later Datura or Jimson weed is one of them. It's a very potent deliriant hallucinogen. But cannabis is also a sacred plant of Shiva. If we delve into medieval writings in India, looking at cannabis lore, we find some actually very positive statements about it. So you could see here from a 15th century text. This desire-filling drug was obtained by men on the earth through the desire for the welfare of all people. To those who regularly use it, it begets joy and destroys every anxiety. That's kind of interesting because cannabis can exacerbate anxiety. Again, it depends on the person. One author documented the development of tantric cannabis use around the 7th century as a mingling of Shaivite, that in other words means worship of Shiva, Hinduism, and Tibetan Buddhism. And there's an 11th century text still it's consulted today in regard to sexual practice, and one that promotes sexual pleasure in both genders, but evidently there was a early connection here with cannabis. I have to say a few words about tantrism. So tantric is a highly esoteric and mystical strain within both Hinduism and Buddhism. Most forms of tantrism, what are known as right hand or right-handed tantrism, are quite sort of orthodox or regular in their ideas about pursuing mystical knowledge. But a secondary tradition is called left hand or left-handed tantrism. Again, you can find it both in Hinduism and Buddhism, which involves the inversion of all the norms of Buddhist or Hindu society and thought. So here's an article, or a snippet from something called Spiritual Curiosity, your guide for your inner journey. Left hand tantra, use of 5 forbidden things, sex, intoxicants to break attachment to the world. So using sexual union, wine or other intoxicants, meat, fish, and originally parched grain, or it really comes to mean money. So things that holy people pursuing the path of holiness are supposed to avoid completely. Most Hindu or Buddhist, Buddhist monks or Hindu holy men are going to generally be celibate, certainly avoid eating meat, avoid any sort of intoxicating substances, or certainly avoiding alcohol. But yet in left-hand tantrism, intoxicants became very important. Sometimes this went to extremes. I have read of tantric rituals, left-hand tantric rituals that were conducted in ceremonies that involved orgiastic sex between Brahmin men and Dalit, or in other words, so-called untouchable women, drinking wine out of human skulls, smearing your bodies with the ash of cremated human beings, just inverting everything. So I just want to note this is a minor or subsidiary tradition, but it is there. And that was probably where cannabis reached its more extreme use. But that said, Hindu holy men today, whether associated with tantric beliefs or any other practices, very often do use cannabis. And particularly, they use the potent forms, ganja, which is basically the high-quality flowers, charas, more like a hashish, processed, concentrated variety. Would not have been smoked in the old days. It is today. So you can see a Hindu holy man in India smoking cannabis. I have read some works on Indian society in early 20th century, which maintained that in a lot of India, Brahmin leaders would, teachers and priests would never touch alcohol or eat meat, but would smoke cannabis. Big difference between India. And I did find an article from fairly obscure Journal of the Psychiatrists Association of Nepal, but it was a detailed study of Hindu holy men in Nepal, followers of the god Shiva. But the author found, and I should say too, the author was very upset with this finding. It didn't make him happy, but that holy men, sadhus, consume cannabis to aid in meditation. Many are believed that it is a substance favored by Lord Shiva and should be used, and the result was most of these holy men were using cannabis daily. Now that said, most people in India, most Indians today, Hindu Indians, don't consume ganja or charas, but they do consume bhang, particularly on holidays. So bhang is a cannabis-infused drink, especially at the ceremony of Holi, which is a Hindu festival in the spring. It's marked by throwing colored powder on people. It's a very joyous day of celebration. And as this article says, during Holi, a large population of India is entranced with cannabis, specifically bhang. So this is very normal and regular. In fact, in India, bhang is not included within the definition of cannabis, where laws have been passed against the more potent varieties, but bhang is allowed. And how potent is it? I've asked a number of Indian people, well, when you drink bhang, do you get high? And I've had various responses. I asked ChatGPT, and it says, well, how potent is it? Well, the answer is sort of not very potent, but it depends. It depends on how you prepare it, how much cannabis is in it, and so on. I think sometimes it's probably a very low amount of THC and won't do much. Sometimes it can probably be considerable. My second to last slide here, my last substantive slide, is to note that just like with tea and with pan or betel nut, in India there's a big emphasis on making it tasty with milk and spices and sugar. So here's an ingredient for a bhang masala chai recipe. So it's a cannabis tea. You can see the cannabis leaves on it. And what do we have? We have cannabis leaves, stems, or flowers, water, milk, sugar, cinnamon, cloves, cardamom, peppercorns, minced ginger, coconut oil or butter, and half cream or milk of choice, and a lot of the latter. So a very tasty and rich beverage. I don't know how high it's going to get you. I should note it doesn't say anything about cooking the dried cannabis leaves, stems, or flowers. Well, first, if you put leaves and stems, you're not going to get much THC out of it. Even if you put a lot of flower, if it's uncooked, you're not going to get any psychoactive effect. I'll talk about this in the next lecture. For cannabis to be effective, it has to be heated either by smoking it or by cooking it, but it has to be a carboxyl group has to be driven off the molecule. Otherwise, it won't fit into the receptor. Again, it's a lock and key kind of a system. And if the key is not shaped right, it won't fit into that lock and you won't have any effects. So this recipe doesn't say anything about cooking it. So I don't think you would have any effect at all, which just leaves me curious. And I've tried to find out more information on this issue, but I can only give it so much time. My concluding slide, I just want to talk about what will be entailed in the lecture on cannabis, part 2. I'll talk about the drug use cannabis spread among Sufi mystics in the medieval Muslim world, and a lot of controversies surrounding that, controversies at the time and up to this day. Then it's spread into sub-Saharan Africa, which is not very well understood, but it certainly happened. And then much later, 19th century spread into Europe and then into the United States. Then the Prohibition movement against cannabis in the 1930s. And then the post-World War II revival of cannabis culture. Sorry, another typo in there. So I will record this second lecture soon, probably tomorrow, and post it on the Geocurrents YouTube site. Thank you for listening, and I hope you can tune in again.